And we can proceed to the next presentation, which is Russian Eda, Predication, and Big DPs by Irina Burukina, Lena, Borise, and Marcel Dikken of MTA Research Institute for Linguistics, Harvard University, and it was Laurent University. Irina, will you be presenting? Okay, so the presentation is here, and we can start.
Yes, thank you so much. I will present the first part, and then Lena will present the second half of this talk. So, yes, in this talk, we will consider the so-called Eda constructions in Russian, and we will focus on two kinds of such constructions. So first is Eda nom 2, Eda followed by the nominative phrase. Like here, you can see it, this was my brother, right? So such constructions are used for this identificational focus usually. And the second kind of construction we will consider is nominative Eda nominative. So I will abbreviate the first nominative phrase as nom 1, the second as nom 2. So in this case, we have something like Petya, this was my brother, and such sentences usually have this accusative or identity reading, right? And Eda in all these constructions is an invariant proximal demonstrative, so it cannot change. And for all these sentences, we propose essentially the following. So we argue that in all these constructions, Eda is underlyingly the predicate. So it forms this predication, a small clause with nom 2, where nom 2 is the subject of predication, and then it undergoes obligatory raising to spec TP position. And when nom 1 is present, we argue that nom 1 forms a constituent with Eda, namely a big DP, where Eda is the head, the D head, and nom 1 is merged in the specifier position of this DP. This is essentially our analysis. And you can notice that our proposal goes against several existing analyses. So for instance, we argue against analyzing Eda as the subject of predication. We argue that it is a predicate. And we also argue against analyzing it as a dedicated functional head on the clausal spine. So we believe that Eda is the D head inside a DP, right? And we also argue against analyzing nom 1, at least in all such constructions, as a hanging topic. I will talk about it a bit later in more detail. So let me go through the argumentation. So first, let us focus on Eda nominative constructions. As I've just said, here we believe that Eda is the predicate of the small clause. Nom 2 is the subject of the small clause. The two are related by the silent relator, but this is not what we see on the surface, right? So we know that in Russian, I cannot say, for instance, my brother was this. Мой брат был это. I must say this was my brother. So we believe that Eda must undergo this raising to spec TP, and the raising is motivated by the fact that Eda always corresponds to given information. So it must end up in the spec TP atopic position in Russian. And at the same time, nom 2 always corresponds to this new information. So if it occupies the close final position, it can be associated with identificational focus, which is also good for us. And this analysis can straightforwardly account for the fact, for example, that the copula that we see in such constructions can never agree with Eda. It must always agree with the nominative phrase. And well, nominative phrase to begin with must always be nominative, right? So we argue that that's because nom 2 is the subject of predication and it is probed directly by the T head. And we can also demonstrate that Eda is indeed a predicate proform. So if you take a look at this example in 6, here we have this short dialogue, right? So the first speaker says, I think that Isabel of France was the famous wife of Henry VI. And the famous wife of Henry VI is here the predicate. So if the second speaker wants to refer back to this predicate, they must use Eda. They cannot use a personal pronoun, for example. So we see this contrast in Russian between Eda on the one hand, which is a predicate proform, and personal pronouns like she or he on the other hand, which can substitute arguments, for example, or the subject, right? And we can also notice that Eda, for instance, cannot appear in predicative copular constructions where we try to use something else as a predicate. So for instance, if I try to say something like, this was my brother, or that this was my brother, with eta, all such sentences are ungrammatical. We argue that that's because eta already occupies the predicate position here. So we cannot use the second main predicate in the same clause, essentially. And we can see the similar fact already moving on to constructions with two nominative phrases. So for example, nom2 cannot refer to a property. So I can say Peter is a plumber, but I cannot use eta in such constructions. And we suggest that that's because on the one hand, this nominative phrase plumber cannot be used as the subject of predication because it denotes profession or, for instance, a type of temper, basically a property, right? And on the other hand, we cannot put it in the predicate position because the predicate position is occupied by eta. So we essentially have to pick up one of the two, either eta or the plumber, right? And speaking about these constructions with two nominative phrases and one eta, so we argue that there as well, eta is underlying the predicate. So it occupies this predicate position in the small clause. The subject of the small clause is nom2. Then eta must undergo movement to spec TP. However, here we would like to talk a little bit more about the internal structure of this eta constituent. So we argue that what looks like eta, just like one word, is essentially a big DP. Eta occupies the D head in this big DP. The semantic head here is the silent pro in the NP part. And then the specifier position of this big DP, maybe it can be occupied by this nominative phrase, right? So when we have nominative, eta, nominative, nominative and eta form together a single constituent, where nominative is in the specifier position, eta is in the D head, the so-called big DP again. And this analysis allows us to account for the fact, for instance, that nominative 1, when it's present, never controls the agreement. So you can see an example here in 11, my plagues of Egypt, this was Peter. The copula must always agree with Peter. It cannot agree with the plagues of Egypt. And again, this is straightforwardly accounted for. So that's just because nom1 is still, nom1 is not the subject of predication. Nom1 is not in the direct relationship with T, and T agrees with nom2, which is the notional subject of predication. We can also notice that this unit nom1 eta has limited distribution. So for example, it cannot appear in fragment answers or in coordinate structures. You can see examples here in 12 and 13. And we suggest that that's because in Russian big DPs, the complement of D, this little pro, must always be silent, right? And in turn, it must be licensed by being in a local relationship with the structurally present non-elliptical finite T. Unfortunately, I don't have time right now to go through these examples and to talk about this licensing in more detail, but we can talk about that during the question answer period. We have the material in the appendix of this slide. And finally, I mentioned at the beginning that we do not agree with the idea that nominative 1, when it's present in such constructions, is always a hanging topic. And here you can see some examples that suggest that that is indeed not the case. So this construction, nominative, eta, nominative, can readily be embedded under non-breach predicates. And we do not expect this behavior from hanging topics. So we know that hanging topics cannot be embedded under non-breach predicates and non-breach verbs, for example. So here, if you take a look at 14, surprising that Iron Man, this is Tony. So here we have this nominative, eta, nominative construction, happily embedded under this predicate удивительно. And удивительно has been demonstrated by Polinsky and Posdom, for example, isn't a non-breach predicate. And now I pass the word to Lena.
Hello, everyone. I'll take over from here. Let me just share my screen. There we go. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen? Yeah. Perfect. Yes. Great. Wonderful. Okay, great. So like Irina just said, we just provided to you the overview of the syntactic properties of these num1 eta num2 constructions as we see them and the analysis that we propose for them. What I would like to do in the remainder of this presentation is tell you a little bit about the prosody of these constructions and also a little bit about the implications of this analysis that we're developing for them. And we'll start with the prosodic facts first. So the prominent prosodic fact that you may be thinking about as well, and that we frequently get questions about, is the question whether there is some sort of an obligatory intonational break that happens between num1 and eta. It seems to be commonly assumed that there is something like a pause or some sort of a prosodic interruption, some sort of a prosodic break between these two parts of the utterance, so between num1 and eta. Why this is important? Well, because if there is indeed a prominent prosodic break there, that of course goes, well, it does not provide direct evidence against our analysis, but it kind of undermines it, because if indeed within a constituent we have a prominent prosodic break, that's not exactly expected. That's not what usually happens within DPs, for example. And so that's something that we need to explain. So we decided to look into that, and what we found, I think, is kind of interesting. We found that, in fact, the prosody of these constructions, so num1 eta num2 constructions, is much more varied than what one might expect. And we found this based on a random sample of examples that we took from the multimedia subcorpus of the Russian national corpus. In particular, what we found is that it is the case that in some num1 eta num2 constructions, the left edge of eta is indeed aligned with the left edge of a prosodic phrase. This may be manifested in a number of ways. Most prominently, there may be a pause, or there may be a strong glottal onset on the initial vowel in eta, or the two might be combined in a single utterance. Interestingly, though, this does not seem to be an intrinsic property of these constructions. It rather seems to come from information structure. So it's a property of these num1 eta num2 constructions in strongly emphatic contexts. So those that require particular emphasis. We also found the same property, so more evidence for a prosodic break in those contexts that involve contrast and also those that involve ellipsis, and especially a combination of contrast and ellipsis. And we're going to show you some example of those. But crucially, what's most important for us is that again, it doesn't seem to be like this prosodic break is an intrinsic property of these constructions. Rather, it seems to come from information structure. One thing that we briefly mentioned in Irina's part of the presentation was that the relationship between the num1 eta num2 construction that we analyze and constructions that look the same on the surface but involve a hanging topic. Like Irina said, there are some where we can present evidence that there is no evidence for there being a hanging topic. In fact, there is evidence against there being a hanging topic. But there are similar constructions in which we can actually say that there is probably a hanging topic. And with respect to prosody of these, what we have to say is that there doesn't seem to be a one-to-one correlation between syntax, so whether num1 is a hanging topic or whether it's a specifier of a big DP, and the way they're realized in prosody. Again, prosody just seems to be an artifact of information structure. So let me show you some examples finally. Here is one from an interview with Navalny, where he says that the Moscow City Duma is the body that reflects the political representation of Muscovites. And hoping that the technology will work, I'll be able to play it to you.
Мосгордума – это тот орган, который отражает политическое представительство москвичей.
So as you can hear, there was indeed a prominent prosodic break between Mosgorduma and the rest of the utterance. You can see it in the spectrogram here that there was a prominent pause between the two, and indeed we could hear it as well. But you can also sense that it is there by virtue of the fact that there was a strong emphasis on Mosgorduma. Maybe we were talking about this before in the same interview, but it's not just a neutral kind of an utterance. Here is another example from an interview with Sergei Lavrov, where he says that the Minsk Protocol of the 5th of September is some sort of a framing document. And let me play it for you.
Минский протокол от 5 сентября – это рамочная бумага.
So here, in contrast with the first example that we heard, there isn't much of a pause between the first part of the utterance between num1 and eta. What you can see instead is that there is a strong glottal onset on eta. I have it annotated here as a glottal stop. You can also see it just in the pitch track, because the pitch tracker gets confused because of there being glottalization, and that's why it thinks that pitch is all the way up here, even though it isn't really. So in this case, the same kind of emphasis, maybe some sort of an assertiveness that the speaker is trying to channel, is manifested not by there being a pause, but by virtue of there being this strong glottal onset on eta. That said, what we found is that the examples that do not have any kind of pause or any kind of a prosodic boundary are also not uncommon. And here is one of them from another interview that says, money is the opportunity to spend it. And let me play it for you.
Деньги – это возможность их потратить.
I can play it again.
Деньги – это возможность их потратить.
So as you can hear here, there isn't much of a pause between the two parts of the utterance. You also can't see anything that would point to a pause in the spectrogram. In fact, you can see how the two vowels just run into each other. So there isn't any silence and there isn't any strong glottal onset there either. But nevertheless, the sentence sounds perfectly felicitous. It's just pronounced with less emphasis. And so we take this as evidence that it is not, in fact, an obligatory feature of Russian to include a strong prosodic break into these contexts. I have another example here that I'll skip for the reasons of time. And finally, here is one that shows that whenever a construction, a num1 eta num2 construction includes ellipsis and contrast, that also creates a context where that favors there being a break or some sort of a prosodic break or a pause between the two parts. So this is a long sentence. We'll only listen to a part of it. It says here, two lines are shown. The first one is a predicted curve. Другая – это среднее предсказание будущего развития численности человечества. So we have this explicit contrast between the two types of curves, and moreover, in the second conjunct, the nominal head, the word for curve, is actually omitted. And what you can see here in the spectrogram already, there is going to be a big piece of silence. And let me play it for you.
Другая – это среднее предсказание будущего развития численности человечества.
So you could hear that there was indeed a strong break, but again, it seems to be more of a almost a rhetorical device. It's just something to channel emphasis. So without further ado, what we hope that these examples have shown is that it is not the case that there is always a prosodic break in this context, but we've been thinking about why it is the case that there is this perception that this prosodic break is obligatory. And it seems to us that it may be something that is in fact rooted in orthography. And maybe, especially if you went through Russian orthography schooling in secondary school, this has been drilled into us that a dash is mandatory in this context between num1 and eta. And the commonly cited rationale for this dash being there is that it represents a pause or some sort of silence. But we think that orthography in these cases, in fact, is probably misleading, because in similar equative constructions without eta, for example, the orthographic rule is to use a dash with positive statements. So something like Jack собака, Jack is a dog, you would have a dash there, but in the corresponding negative utterance, Jack не собака, Jack is not a dog, the convention is not to have a dash. Prosodically, though, both of these utterances, they can be completely identical. So it seems to us, this provides evidence that the dash, the presence of a dash, is in fact not correlated with prosody. And so we probably shouldn't rely on orthography in our judgments about the prosodic properties of an utterance. Okay, this is all that I had to say about the prosody of these. And in the remaining time, let me just very quickly go over the implications of this analysis that we're proposing. There are two main ones, and we think that they square very nicely with what we're suggesting. One is this a structural parallel between the eta-copular constructions that we've been discussing and clausal prolapses. So how does this work? We have the example in 21. What this shows, the example in 21, is that in other contexts, big DP may be an argument like any other DP. This is not something that our analysis precludes. So examples like что мы гуляем в парке, это приятно, что мы гуляем в парке. It's nice that we're walking in the park. Or that we're walking in the park is nice. In these ones, what happens is that the embedded CP and eta together form the same kind of a big DP, and that serves as a subject of приятно. And in a parallel fashion to the structures we've been discussing before, eta is a D head, and the subordinate clause is the specifier of the same projection. And so what happens in an example like 21b, for example, the CP is extraposed into the right periphery and eta becomes a proleptic pronoun. But structurally, as you can see in 22a and b, the structures are basically very similar to what we have seen in the nom1 and the nom2 constructions, because in both kinds of constructions, the eta is going to be the D head, and the difference between them is basically what occupies the specifier of the same projection. So we take this to be a welcome consequence of this account. And the second implication is this another structural parallel between the eta copular constructions and eta focus constructions. So different kinds of structures that involve eta that we haven't talked about. And in particular, well, as we've seen, again, we take eta to be the D head, whereas in the focus constructions, like what you see in 23a, кого Петя пригласил, так это Машу, eta is a topic head. This has been suggested in the previous literature. It seems to be a different kind of eta because it's not referential. It seems to be there for purely functional reasons, yet it's obligatory. But the parallel that we would like to point out is that, again, if in both of these constructions, eta is going to be a functional head that links together two elements. In one of the analysis of eta focus constructions, they consist from a question-answer pair. So, кого Петя пригласил, это Машу Петя пригласил. And so what eta does is it connects these two parts of the clause. And it's as a functional head. And so in this sense, it's basically parallel to what we've shown the function of D to be in nom1 eta nom2 constructions, where the two of them are also connected by the same functional element, D, which is eta. And we take this to be a particularly welcome consequence of this approach because it basically points out a fundamental parallel between these two kinds of eta that are usually taken to be disparate. Because again, the eta that we've been dealing with seems to have referential properties. It's less of a functional element, whereas the one in 23 has more of a functional function. But we would like to suggest that structurally, they're basically the same. So that is it. And let me just very quickly recap. So what we've shown you is that eta, in eta nom2 constructions, eta is the underlying predicate, and it's merged in the complement of the relator head and then raised by a predicate inversion. Accordingly, in nom1 eta nom2 constructions, nom1 and eta are a big DP, so a single constituent, where nom1 is merged in the specifier, silent pro sits in the complement, and eta itself is the D head. We've shown you that prosodically, these constructions do not necessarily include a prosodic break. And we've also shown you that this analysis squares nicely with some other constructions in Russian that involve eta. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation. We have time for questions and comments. Any questions, comments, complaints?
There is one in the chat.
Yes, Anton.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
I find the big DP analysis very promising. Nevertheless, I have two small questions. One of them is concerned the prosodic break and its interpretation. If we have structures like NP1, eta in P2, and we have a prosodic break before eta, this might suggest that the first in P simply doesn't count. It isn't a copula, but it's just a topicalized element in front of a structure like eta, say, Минский протокол, long pause, это рамочное соглашение. So the Minsk protocol, this is a framing agreement, something like that. So do you have any arguments against the fronted topic analysis? This is my first question. And the second question is, I would like to know how your analysis, how your conclusion that eta is an underlying predicate helps us to explain Russian structures where eta seemingly ends up in the position of suffix subject. As far as I know, the most conclusive evidence comes from the ability of Russian expletive eta to assign predicate of instrumental case in structures like это было странным. If you drop это, было странным is no longer possible in the standard dialect of Russian. So I assume that это can be a suffix subject, and I would like to know what we can learn from the DP analysis about suffix subjects in Russian. Thanks.
Okay, I think I can probably take the first question, and maybe Irina can take the second one, or we can help each other out. Thank you so much. These are interesting questions. So regarding your first one, am I correct in thinking that when you say that something is interpreted as a topic, do you base that on the way it's pronounced?
Well, I think that I'm basing on the possibility of making a prosodic break before eta. So eta is not necessarily an element which is placed after the first contact prosodic host. So just it can be close initial element.
I mentioned this briefly, but maybe this I should probably say this again properly. So it seems that there are indeed two underlying structures that these constructions nom1 and the nom2 may have, and one of them does involve a hanging topic and the other one does not. This were established based on embeddability of these under non-bridge predicates. Some constructions like this and some do not. We unfortunately do not have more to say about how else to differentiate these, and I don't have an example at hand because we didn't have these in the slides, but there does seem to be a difference between them. When it comes to prosody though, there is no one-to-one correspondence between these. So it is indeed the case, it seems, that whenever something is a topic, it is going to have a prosodic break. But these examples that we use that involve a big DP may or may not have a break. And here it is determined by information structural factors. So it seems that only taking the presence of a prosodic break as evidence does not take us very far, if you see what I mean, because the prosodic break being there may come from syntax, or it may come from information structure. So, and differentiating these without bringing in other factors seems to be difficult, and we haven't gone that far yet. It is indeed the case that this is something for us to look at more. But it seems that, like I'm repeating myself, there is no one-to-one correspondence with these, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, and with regard to your second question, so I think, again, Lena mentioned this briefly at the very last part of the talk. So if we have something like это было странным, right? So this was strange instrumental. So I would say that here we have this hidden proposition that we are trying to characterize. So basically we have something like это было странным, что Петя пришел. It was strange that Peter came, for example. So this is something that we can accommodate with our clausal prolapsus analysis, I believe. So we suggest that big DP can be used as the subject. In Eda nominative constructions, it is used as the predicate, but in constructions where we have this clause, right, and then we have this instrumental predicate, for example, there the big DP can occupy the subject position initially. So there the clause, whether it's overt or whether it's hidden, will be in the specifier position of this big DP. Eta will be in the D head, and then the whole construction will be in the subject position of predication. That's my idea, at least, if I understood the question correctly. Maybe Lena disagrees with me, I don't know.
Thank you. Just a great explanation. Just one empirical difficulty. There is no control from sentential arguments in standard Russian. So a structure like that he came late was bad in the instrumental case. То, что он пришел поздно, было плохим, is not quite felicitous, while the structure with eta is good. So it's just not spell out, but probably some kind of syntax in proper terms. Okay, that's just...
yes, I have to apologize, but we have one more question. Mark Baker, please.
My question is actually very much on the same topic as where we've ended up. I enjoyed your analysis, but as I've tried to use big DP analyses, though, some of the challenges can be to make sure that they don't do too much. Sometimes they're a little weird. And I was wondering, like, what would rule out using eta with as the D head with a noun phrase specifier in a normal subject position? And then a related question would be, if that's indeed out, I don't know if it is, but you know, maybe you showed that it's possible in an argument position with a CP specifier, and it's possible in a predicate kind of usage with an NP specifier. But then, you know, looking systematically at all the combinations, what if it's what could rule out if it the etna in the D position with an NP specifier is argument? Any thoughts about that?
So from my side, I can only say that I guess at this point we don't have a decisive answer to your question, but thank you so much for the question itself. We've been thinking a little bit about this internal structure of this big DP, and we had this thought at one moment that maybe what we're dealing here is the second predication inside the big DP itself now. So we have like nom1 being the predicate of the pro, for example, and this D head being kind of a relator inside this big DP. But that's a very draft idea at that moment. Maybe this can help us to restrict somehow further the distribution of different kinds of big DP. So for example, as you mentioned, big DP with the CP in the predicate position, or big DP with a nom1 in the argument position. That's the only thought I have right now. I don't know. Lena, any?
Yeah, I think indeed going through all of these combinations would be something for us to do. That's a very good suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe this session is over. I would like to thank all the speakers for their presentation and the audience for being here. I want to apologize for staying invisible for the entire session. That's because the computer I'm using has no camera. So we're going to have a 15-minute break and see each other again for Mark Baker's talk. It's going to be the same conference, so you can just stay connected or quit and reconnect. That's up to you. So we have what would have been otherwise called a coffee break. Thank you for being here and see you soon.
Может, кому-то уже интересно.
Мне кажется, сейчас большинство участников вышло, так что это на... Я не знаю.
Я включила запись на всякий случай обратно. Если кто-то пропустил, может потом послушать.
Вот, вопрос такой, значит, он так исключительно на понимание логики аргументации. То есть вот вы говорите, у вас есть какой-то вот этот релятор дендикеновский, да? И у него есть, его комплементом является предикат. И этот предикат выражается как это. Но без определения того, что такое предикат, совершенно невозможно понять, невозможно оценить, по-моему, работы для анализа. То есть, например, есть разные определения предикатов, которые здесь явно не подходят. Да? То есть, ну, например, не подходит определение предиката как именная группа без детерминатора, то есть то, что считает тип из E в T. Да? Не подходит ну, то есть, получается, что единственное определение, которое подходит, это такое, то есть определение предиката эквивалентно «я» комплимент релятора. Но это уже сам по себе анализ. Ну, то есть, получается такая некоторая циркулярность в логике рассуждения, если я правильно, если я ничего не упустил. Вот, такой вопрос. Упустил ли я что-нибудь?
Я думаю, что, если я правильно поняла вопрос, его можно, опять же, немного перефразировать, как «идите, посмотрите, что у вас происходит в семантике». Потому что вопрос, что такое предикат, для меня, например, по большей части вопрос уже в сторону семантики, да, то есть какой должен быть тип, например, у данной конструкции, чтобы ее можно было использовать как предикат. Лично я пока на это не смотрела, но точно надо посмотреть. Вот.
Нет, так мы говорим про синтаксическую структуру, все-таки хотелось бы, чтобы ответ был синтаксическим, потому что, ну, то есть, его можно переформулировать, наверное, так: каковы субкатегоризационные требования релятора. Вот.
Наверное, если бы Марсель был с нами, он мог бы на этот вопрос ответить более точно, но, насколько я понимаю, вот это понимание того, что собой представляет предикат в relator phrase, оно берется из работы Марселя, наверное, я так понимаю, что это просто берется целиком оттуда. К сожалению, если вот Марсель нет с нами, если бы он был здесь, он мог бы нам точнее про это рассказать, наверное, это было бы полезно. Но, да, как бы, наверное, по крайней мере, я наверное, больше того, что Ирина сказала, сказать сейчас не могу. Наверное, это где-то circular сказать, что predicate is the complement of the relator head, was the complement of the relator head is the predicate. Но я так понимаю, наверное, там есть какая-то аргументация, которой мы, к сожалению, не владеем сейчас on the spot.
Вот, и совсем еще маленькое дополнение. То есть, если игнорировать семантику, я считаю, что в некоторых случаях нужно игнорировать семантику и посмотреть на синтаксическую структуру, в данном случае, потому что, ну, смотрите, вы говорите, что вот это проформа, ну, вы говорите, что это проформа для предиката, мы оставим в стороне, что такое предикат, и посмотрим на категорию это, и мы скажем, ну, вы прямо говорите, это детерминатор. То есть получается, что это имеет ту же самую дистрибуцию, что и любая другая полная именная группа, например, с указательным местоимением. И, соответственно, вся дистрибуция это должна полностью повторяться дистрибуцией любой определенной именной группы. По-моему, это все-таки не совсем так.
Здесь у нас есть некоторая хитрость, потому что, насколько я помню, у нас в анализе в этой большой именной группе сидит маленькая про. И маленькое про нужно каким-то образом лицензировать. То есть мы уже частично можем ограничить дистрибуцию вот этой большой DP через лицензирование про. То есть поскольку у нас это, которое сидит в вершине D, оно все-таки не деиктическое, да, оно инвариантное, оно, например, не может самостоятельно полностью лицензировать это маленькое про за счет, скажем, внутреннего конкорда, там, внутреннего согласования, как хотите назовите. Да? То есть нам нужна поддержка извне. Так, например, мы объясняем, почему у нас вот эта большая DP невозможна в фрагментарных ответах, например, да? Или почему она невозможна в координации. Потому что нужна поддержка извне от неэллиптической финитной вершины T, например. То есть мы смотрим в этом направлении, потому что, естественно, абсолютно согласна, что нужно дистрибуцию ограничивать каким-то образом, что она не должна повторять дистрибуцию обычного деиктического это, естественно. Или анафорического это, про которое, я так понимаю, рассказывала Ольга сегодня утром. Я вижу Ольгу на экране, по крайней мере.
Спасибо.
Спасибо.
Кажется, там был еще один вопрос.
Да, у меня есть вопрос, если можно, на повторение. На самом деле оказалось вопросы, которые Паша задал. Как ограничить дистрибуцию этого causal proleptic, это? И там действительно, вот я думал про эти примеры, мне кажется, там, во-первых, когда добавляется experiencer, то они становятся несколько хуже. То есть это им приятно, что, это мне приятно, что. Например, это удивительно, что он пришел, это им удивительно, можно сказать, это им было удивительно, но это им удивительно, что он опоздал, немножко странно. И то же самое с примерами causal subjects, ну, с глаголами object experience verbs, типа это ее удивило, что он опоздал, мне кажется, немножко странно. И вот у меня ощущение, я не проверял это по корпусу и в экспериментах, но у меня ощущение, что единственные примеры, где вот этот clausal prolapsus хорош, это именно где в позиции, ну там, грубо говоря, предиката, да, традиционного, выступает прилагательное, типа приятно или там странно и так далее. Возможно, я не прав, и мне хотелось бы ваш анализ как-то вот может как-то естественным образом объяснять это ограничение, если вы в него верите, или вы в него не верите.
Михаил,
да.
вы намекаете на то наблюдение, которое я сделал, там, кажется, в году 7.
Да, совершенно верно.
Но чтобы опровергнуть, наверное, надо доказать, что либо примеры я придумал, во-вторых, доказать, что они не связаны именно с дативным субъектом, а связаны с чем-то еще, как вы сказали, то есть какое-то другое определение, какие-то другие подводимые под экспериенсера вещи, например, заменить мне на для меня, если будет такое же ограничение, значит, другой анализ подходит. Да, извините, это я встрял, потому что не выключился вовремя.
Да, спасибо, интересно. Я буду говорить за себя, может быть, у Ирины есть еще мысли на этот счет. Мы, к сожалению, это похожий ответ на то, что я говорила раньше. Мы глубоко не смотрели на пролепсис. И поэтому как бы я, например, сходу не могу сказать, каким именно образом это встраивается в то, что мы сейчас предлагаем, но это опять-таки идет в список тех вещей, на которые нам обязательно нужно будет посмотреть. Тот первый пример, который вы привели про «мне было странно», «ему было странно», да, вот это, мне кажется, оно работает только с сильным каким-то контрастивным фокусом на местоимении. Второй пример, который вы привели, мне кажется, что он на самом деле не такой плохой. Не знаю, может быть, это просто отличие...
какой был второй пример? Я уже не помню.
Второй пример был... сейчас.
Это ее удивило, что...
Вот, это ее удивило, что он пришел.
Да.
Потому что мне кажется, что когда CP postposed into the right periphery, это ее удивило, особенно с правильной просодией, это ее удивило, что он пришел. Мне кажется, что это на самом деле не так и плохо. Не знаю.
Ну, я не вспомню сейчас статью Антона, на которую, как я понимаю, вы частично ссылаетесь. Вот, то есть, точнее, как я не помню, есть ли там статистика или примеры однозначно маркированы как хорошие и плохие. Но я соглашусь с Леной, что я, допустим, вижу некоторую разницу между «это им удивительно что» и «это нас удивило что». То есть второй пример почему-то мне не кажется таким ужасным по сравнению с первым. И это очень интересно, и нам точно надо на это смотреть.
Если вы так считаете, значит, вы поддерживаете изначальную теорию, что контраст связан с субъектностью дативных аргументов предикативов и, возможно, безличных глаголов. А в нас удивило, что валентная рамка другая, и, может быть, там какие-то роли немножко иные, ну и винительный падеж не субъект. Но это дискуссия просто по ходу дела. Сейчас у нас через 3 минуты приглашенный доклад, коллеги.
Спасибо большое за все комментарии. Спасибо.
Спасибо большое.